President of the European Parliament, dear Mr. Martin Schulz, thank you for this invitation and for the words you have shared with us about the victims of the bad weather in the south of France. President, Madam Chancellor, members of the European Union, President of the Commission, it's true, the French President and the German Chancellor coming here together to address the European Parliament is an exceptional event. At the same time, it's not an unprecedented event, because some 26 years ago, almost to the day, Helmut Kohl and Francois Mitterrand came to this very place to address the members of the European Parliament. At the time, a great wind of liberty was blowing over the continent, knocking down the walls in emancipating countries and giving renewed hope to nations and peoples. Francois Mitterrand and Helmut Kohl presented 26 years ago. With the assistance of Jacques Delors, they presented action for solidarity, which was to be afforded in order to welcome in people. Refugees, people who were convinced that Western Europe would be a home for them, and all of Europe fell into place. And the hopes invested in them were substantial. The shared hopes of Kohl and Mitterrand would be that they would be creating union for Europe. In so doing, they would roll over the mandates of the founding fathers. An internal market with social rules. The project of a single currency, this was all part and parcel of the same process. And would be with the same resolve. Now, some 26 years on, Chancellor Angela Merkel and myself are here addressing this House again because of the 25th anniversary of the German reunification, but also because living through new tragedies and drama, and this poses the whole continent new challenges. To tell the truth, it's years now that Europe has been in a succession of crises, the financial crisis. It sprang outside this continent, but spread to this continent, and has brought in its wake an economic crisis, which we are now emerging from, and also a social crisis, with millions of young people out of a job and unemployed. Now there is a humanitarian crisis, which we need to confront, with an influx of refugees caused by the destabilization of entire regions in the Middle East and Africa, because of outbreaks of warfare and religious hatred, and also security crises, with war, which is not very far away, which is at the frontier of our frontier in Ukraine, and also terrorist attacks, which have affected several countries of our continent, including my own. With each crisis, fear appears. We need to live with fear, but we must not be dominated by those fears. And nonetheless, there is an inclination, a tendency, a temptation to retreat into our own national shells when there is a crisis, in a kind of beggar-my-neighbor attempt to avoid the problems. And that's what experience and history tells us. That is not the way.
Mais elles ne peuvent pas condamner l'Europe à la frilosité et à l'impuissance. Au contraire, elles justifient une Europe
Francois Hollande, French President, addressing the European Parliament, first addressed with Angela Merkel,
et de tenir son rang conformément à ses intérêts et à ses valeurs, valeurs qui ont justifié l'unification de notre continent. Il n'y a donc pas d'autre solution
The only solution, he's saying, is a strong Europe to underpin our sovereignty and our shared sovereignty. Over the recent months and years, France and Germany have sought to find a common response to the aspects we've seen over the past period. We've responded by affirming simple, clear principles of solidarity, of responsibility, and of firmness. Since all of the attacks, he's talking about terrorism here, it's our way of life, and directed at the very soul and spirit of our continent. Can I thank the heads of state and government and the parliamentarians that came to Paris on the 11th of January to demonstrate their solidarity and also their attachment to liberty, to freedom, to what we stand for and what we represent, and to defend all of that from the terrorists whose only intention is to erode the cement that binds us. Hollande speaking in Strasbourg here, if you're just joining us on Euronews. Refugees are victims of convulsions, of troubles in the Middle East, he's saying. European countries are suffering on the front line. They're bearing the brunt.
Solidarité à l'égard de l'Afrique qui se bat pour son développement et pour éviter justement les mouvements de population. Alors, regardons les choses en face.
Looking at the issues surrounding refugees, we're confronted by an unprecedented arrival of refugees, many of them fleeing war and massacre, others looking for a better life. But all of them have endured terrible conditions at the mercy of unscrupulous traffickers. Too many of them have died in atrocious conditions. And now we've seen some of those faces. Those faces are imprinted in our memories. Europe has sought to, first and foremost, save lives, to fight against the traffickers thanks to Frontex and others. I recognize and acknowledge that Europe was slow in understanding the tragedy in the Middle East and in Africa. Europe did not take the measure of the hopes that are invested in it. Those who surrounded been on the receiving end and been looking for a light to steer by. Europe has not given sufficient. Europe has taken some time to organize itself, to live up to our reputation of welcoming people.
Avec la Commission européenne, et je salue ici le président Juncker, a mis sur pied un plan d'ensemble.
Now, President Juncker and the institutions have put into place a plan and back up Italy and Greece, who are on the front line and cannot be left alone with those responsibilities on their own. To help the countries in the Balkans, who are likewise transiting populations, in itself very difficult to cope with. Closer cooperation with Turkey is of the essence, and there are negotiations that have commenced there, and they must be concluded with clear rules, because it's in Turkey where refugees must be given reception, and in return we must provide Turkey with assistance if they're helping us, and ensure these refugees, whether they're in camps or in the population, are able to work, to feed their children, and have hope for the future themselves. If we fail to do that, then of course they are going to come here, and we must put in place reception and identification registration centres, and they must be respected. And there must be a distribution of asylum seekers within member states. That's what we've been seeking to do. And we've been able to do that, 160,000 of them. And we must ensure the rules are properly applied and obligations are delivered and respected. This plan must now be implemented quickly. These are the principles: solidarity, responsibility, same responsibility, the same values that can be applied. When we were looking at the Greek situation, where things were difficult, and Angela Merkel and myself did our bit with the Commission, with all the member states. Those discussions could have floundered. And that would have been more than just a failure. And that would have been a dereliction. We would have been abandoning a country whose civilization and culture is part of our own. This would have been the first breach in the integrity of the Eurozone. And other countries would have come under pressure themselves. And it would have been a resignation, an application of our shared responsibility as Europeans towards the Greek government. The regulations and negotiations were brought to conclusion, and I now hope this will now lead to a debate about debt servicing. This is part of an overall solution. Alexis Tsipras, the Greek Prime Minister, has shown courage in his desire to see his people consulted before that agreement. Now, I say that. Respect for democracy, asking that of the people. They're the same important principles.
Nous devons aussi la démontrer contre le terrorisme. La vigilance doit être de mise.
Responsibility, we must bring that to bear against terrorism. We need to equip ourselves with the necessary methods to ensure our security services can do their job in full respect to the people's freedoms. France adopted a law in order to be able to follow more closely terrorist activity. Europe itself must show that it's part of the responsibility. And there are dossiers that have been a long time coming. Passenger name records, for example. And it's essential for the European Parliament to adopt that text, which is indispensable if we are to be able to take action.
L'Europe a aussi un devoir de fermeté.
Europe also has a duty to show a resolve. In Ukraine, we have responded to brutal fighting, flouting of international law, and preventing war at the gates of our continent is what we've been about. European countries have shown unity in putting in place a regime of sanctions. There has been a debate, a legitimate debate, of the effect and the duration of these sanctions. Germany and France have been particularly committed to that process in concluding and implementing the Minsk agreement. And all last week, Angela Merkel and myself, with the Russian president and Ukrainian president, in the so-called Normandy format, we were minded to respect the wording of the Minsk agreements. The Normandy format, this method, exercised on behalf of Europe, has been particularly effective since the elections in which the separatists scheduled for mid-October. They've been postponed. And that means the Minsk process has been able to continue and carry on, and that weapons have been withdrawn, and soon heavy artillery will follow. We are capable of achieving this in the name of Europe and in the best interest of the world at large. We're prepared to demonstrate resolve, determination and responsibility and solidarity. We're hoping to preserve the Syrian conflict as well, because ISIS, Daesh, they hold many things against us. The regime of Bashar al-Assad has created and continues to nourish that disaster and feed into that disaster. Massacres are taking place, people are being killed on a daily basis. What's happening in Syria is relevant to Europe, because what's happening there will determine for a long time the balance of equilibria in that region and right across the Middle East. If we allow religious conflict between Shiite and Sunni, and this has been the case of months and years, if we allow this to grow further, then don't think for one moment that we'll be protected. This will be all-out war, which could well spread to our own territory. And we must act. France has shouldered its military responsibility in the face of those threats, and all of Europe must now do what it can in humanitarian and political, economic terms to make a contribution to the political future, which brings a future for the Syrian people, an alternative to Bashar al-Assad or Daesh. And it's our duty incumbent on us. It's in our best interest as well as Europeans. And I send out this call to all Europeans so that we can help bring about this transition, in the knowledge that regardless of what the positions are here, it may not be get all of the moderate opposition on side when it comes to addressing the wars of the Syrian people. But we have to make sure everyone who has the will and good intentions, bringing in the United States, the Gulf states, Europe, all of us must lend our support to get a negotiated settlement, a political solution. We will have to demonstrate great solidarity towards others. This is why cooperation with the African countries is so essential. We'll have a summit in November between Africa and Europe in Malta, and it's about going into the root causes. The causes of departure, that people can be persuaded to remain in their own regions, in as far as trying to make it possible for them to have a livable home situation. We approach many subjects, which are all Europe-related, but all are different facets of the same one. As the debate rumbles between sovereignty and sovereigntists in a country, if we're talking about them in one country or sovereignty in Europe, are we going to be able to build on our commonality? Are we going to be divided? We don't need less Europe, we need more Europe. Europe must affirm itself, otherwise we will see the demands of Europe, meaning the return to national frontiers, the abandonment of the euro. Francois Hollande here, making an address to the European Parliament in Strasbourg. He's making an historic address with Angela Merkel, the German Chancellor, who's sat alongside him. The last time these two leaders spoke, well, they haven't spoken together to this Parliament. This is the first time, but the last time German and French leaders spoke together in Strasbourg and addressed the Parliament was back in November 1989, when Helmut Kohl and Francois Mitterrand spoke about the challenges facing Europe a few days after the fall of the Berlin Wall. So clearly this first address from Angela Merkel and Hollande is historic today. He's now saying that sovereignty is in its decline now, and it's just as dangerous. Not providing hope to our populations, not being able to provide something together because of national interventions. Now, looking forward, I'm convinced we must go further, because otherwise we won't just stop. We will go backwards, and this will spell the end of the European project. And this is why I propose the Eurozone should be consolidated and now beefed up. Consolidated and beefed up. as a basis for policies for convergence, for fiscal modernization, for combating tax dumping, and doing more than what we're already doing with the European plan. Institutional rejigging will be required if the Eurozone is to be governable, for the rules to be respected, for benefits to be brought for all. Those choices will be for the countries who are willing, with the parliamentary scrutiny ensuring overall coherence and scrutiny. We need also to strengthen what's called the Schengen area, because questioning freedom of movement for people and returning to internal borders would be a tragic error. Round of applause for remark from Francois Hollande. Any question that Schengen in its current form would help us deal with pressures on the perimeter would fall into another area. Our control of external frontiers involves enhanced cooperation with the frontline states, and it means putting in place a European Coast Guard and a European Border Guard service, as the President of the Commission has proposed. Tomorrow we must come up with a coherent asylum policy, which comes up with a common list of safe countries, convergence of procedures and rights, which will provide greater protection. And that means a common asylum regime for the European Union, and in all of its dimensions. There will be choices. Either we go forward or we go backwards. And going backwards would take us back to powerlessness. This courageous choice is one that we must forge ahead with. And in December next, the Paris conference, we will have an opportunity to salute Europe's pledges on the eve of that conference. It's been key to bringing the Chinese and the Americans on board, headed for the same agreement. It could have been more ambitious, no doubt, and it will need to be built up. There are too many countries still who haven't brought their contributions to the table, and we Europeans must be able to bring in the great carbon market that will give guidance to industry and steer them towards a more sustainable future. Let me salute and pay tribute to the European Parliament in those climate negotiations. Please continue to support the efforts being made by your countries and by Europe in its entirety for us to find our way to an agreement. This is an ambition that extends to our funding side as well, where the money comes from. We must get together $100 billion for the energy transition in the countries that are most vulnerable and the developing countries. We're not there yet. No, we're not. But we still have 2 months. And we need that agreement. We know that there's knowledge, and we recognize the responsibilities we will incur in the future generations. We will need a new conference to sort that out. We must be able to take our decisions on the day, and it's up to the governments. It's incumbent on European governments, first and foremost, and for those who gather in Paris to be mindful of their responsibilities invested in them by you. I hope I can come back to the European Parliament with the very least pride that we had a successful conference in Paris, but also that we were there on the day when the countries of the world, building on local and regional authorities on the world, will also be there. All the associations and the organizations, businesses, trade unions, all of them together. They will be there, setting out the situation, solving a large part of the climate generation for a long time into the future. And that's a rendezvous we cannot miss. French President Francois Hollande making an address to the European Parliament in Strasbourg, if you're just joining us here on Euronews. We must also remember, he says, the needs of agriculture for food, security. in seafood. We need the same resolve in that area as well at the time of crisis. There's certain types of agricultural produce, but in the Member States and Parliament also, we must look for the requisite backup to save our produce and protect those who are most vulnerable. Let me just say a word about the big debate with the United States. France wants those negotiations to represent progress. We want there to be guarantees for the identification of products, for designations of origin, for transparency, and to protect investment for dispute settlements. Must be part of the picture if we're going to get an outcome which brings benefits to all of our economies. Now let me conclude with a reflection, which is of concern to all of us here. I don't imagine that for one moment us here are parliamentarians who are not European and we don't belong to the same ensemble. We are bound together by the same shared values together. Now, 25 years on, after the reunification of a continent, we must still face challenges and choices. We must take choices. The emergencies are there. We cannot blind ourselves to the real world outside, to the realities of the world. No frontier, no barbed wire. It's going to shield us from threats which are appearing on our doorstep. It's for us to take our decisions, those decisions. We need to respond at a time of emergency, keep our eyes on the long term. The Federation of Nation States may remain on our horizon, and in a way, 25 years on, if we're looking towards a new round of unification. The question is, do we want to go back to the old system of the 20th century? Or do we want to go towards a consistent approach for the coming generation, the coming century, on the front foot? We must look for the compromises at the highest possible level. That's the spirit of the cooperation that we've entered into between Angela Merkel and myself, France and Germany, to be partners who can rise to the challenges of this new millennium.